A good Erev Shabbos. This would be a great Shabbat to celebrate a bar mitzvah because we learn that a bar mitzvah takes place at age 13 from a hint in this week's Sedra, Vayishlach. So before we go into that, let's put out a call for anyone who would like to celebrate a bar mitzvah anniversary by reprising your haftorah or Torah reading or davening. Feel welcome. Or making a second bar mitzvah at 83, we have done that. Or a bat mitzvah for anyone who had or never had one. There's at least one of those in the works, hopefully, so watch out for more exciting kiddushes coming your way. If you'd like to re-celebrate, please get in touch with the Gabayim to get yourself on the schedule. We reckon that Shimon and Levi were 13 years of age by the time this parsha takes place, because the Tosfos Yamtiv in his Pirush, his explanation, commentary on Pirkei Avos, figures the Shvatims, the sons of Jacob's birth order, and the timing of their births after their parents' marriage to come out for Shimon and Levi as age 13, just by this moment in time. And since Shimon and Levi are referred to as Ish, a man in this parsha, Ish Charbo, it says, each man took his sword. We combine those two ideas and we determine that 13 is the age at which a boy is called a man. So that is the textual source for bar mitzvah. The context also tells us quite a bit, perhaps even more than we wanted to know or to think about. It says, Vayikchu shnei b'nei Yaakov, Shimon v'Levi, two sons of Yaakov, Shimon and Levi, Achei Dina, it says the brothers of Dina, Ish Charbo, each man took his sword. And it continues, we'll get there in a minute. First we ask the question, what were 13-year-old boys doing with swords? Swords are dangerous. What business did these bar mitzvah bachrim have taking up dangerous weapons like that? Someone could put an eye out. The context here helps us understand what was going on, and it also brings up a raft of important things for us to think about, none of them easy. Here is the context. It seems a fellow named Shechem, who was one of the Amorite people neighboring the settlement of the Jewish people, this fellow Shechem took a shine to Dinah, the only sister among the tribes of Israel. Now, if back in your dating days you ever had to face the older brother or brothers of a girl you were taking out, imagine if there were 11 of them. So Shechem was definitely not going to get himself invited to dinner. That was not in the cards. Rather, he did what he thought was done in those days. In that place, he abducted poor Dinah and had his way with her. Dinah's family was understandably outraged, but the boy himself, Shechem, became obsessed with Dinah. In fact, he asked his father, Hamor, to approach Yaakov asking if it could be arranged that he could marry Dinah properly. Hamor implored Yaakov to allow Dinah to marry his son Shechem and offered his own daughters as potential shidduchim for all Yaakov's sons, and he painted a dreamy, idealistic picture of future intermarriage and peace between these two nations. It's an interesting dynamic. The sons of Yaakov at this point speak up. The Torah says they spoke up cleverly, b'mirma, really means deceptively, i.e. that they never had intention of allowing their sister to marry this rapist. They said this. They said, we cannot allow our sister to marry someone uncircumcised. That's a disgrace to us. The only thing we would consider is if you have Shechem and all the males in your tribe circumcised, then that's something different. They took the plan back to the Amorites, and the Amorites went for it. They all went through with circumcising all their males. On the third day after they all circumcised themselves, the pain was most intense. We learned this before with regard to Avraham circumcising himself as an adult. God came to visit him on the third day, which is the worst. At this very moment, this is when Shimon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, each took his sword and attacked Hamor's people. They killed every male there, including Hamor and his son Shechem, who started the whole business. It's worth pointing out that on the return home, they took their sister Dinah, it says, because she'd been held hostage since this incident began. They brought her home to her family. This incident, this narrative, is going to raise a number of important things for us to think about. Maybe the first is going to be the honor of a family and the value placed on bringing someone home who has been held captive against their will, to say nothing of the violent sexual crime that's detailed in the text. As far as that goes, let's also note simply that the fact that this text does not absolve anyone, does not whitewash anyone, bend over backwards to present violence as anything other than it is. In short, it's a very real and, to our sorrow, very present text. We can ask questions about revenge, about what's come to have been called disproportionate response. It's appropriate to discuss that here because until today it's only the children of Jacob, the Bnei Yisrael, who are called out for disproportionate responses to violent attacks. We can ask about just war theory, the theory of war at all, and about subterfuge used in conflict. Maimonides' view, pretty clear, pretty straightforward. The citizens of Shechem were responsible, like all nations of the world, for the seven essential laws incumbent upon mankind, one of which is to establish courts of law that punish criminals. You have to have a just and ordered society. This story was clear evidence that they failed to do that. They did not punish the perpetrator. So the entire society becomes complicit in the explanation of Rabbi Yitzchak Arama. So they are all guilty. They're all deserving of punishment. In this case, the ultimate punishment. According to this view, this wasn't collective punishment. It was really a case of punishing all the guilty, which means everyone there, because they all remained silent in acquiescence to this crime. Nachmanides, the Ramban, argues. He says that the land of Canaan was full of tribes who practiced idolatry and all forms of immoral behavior. We don't see that there was any mandate to punish entire societies like this. This was the brothers, Shimon and Levi, avenging the assault against their sister. Ramban sees that they also took their revenge on the inhabitants who were clearly under the influence of Shechem, but does not give perspective on the deception or on the collective punishment, other than to say that since they were influenced by their leaders, the brothers did not hesitate to do them in also. Technically speaking, there is no death penalty for the failure to fulfill a positive commandment, only for the actual committing of a prohibited action. There is a tzad to say that here you have a case of kidnapping, hostage taking, which in the Noahide law actually is a capital offense. Or HaChaim HaKadosh says that Shimon and Levi's intention was only to attack the perpetrator, but when they got there, the entire city rose in defense of its leader. Confronted with that kind of a situation where the perpetrators are mixed in together with the so-called civilians, you cannot distinguish between passive defenders and the actual targets. They had no choice other than to fight back against everyone and wound up killing all the inhabitants. This was not their original intention, rather it was a battlefield decision. Or HaChaim also suggests that the brothers planned on the element of surprise to attract the perpetrator and then all the accomplices in that order. They were afraid that Shechem might kill his hostage, their sister. So it was a very calculated campaign with a lot of elements in the balance. Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz writes a chilling insight from the word that appears in this passage, betach, confidence. Shimon and Levi came upon the city with confidence. What was their confidence? They knew this. If they were to attack non-Jews, then other nations who heard about it would surely raise an uproar and come to the rescue to defend Shechem. Once the Shechemites circumcised themselves, and word about that got out after 3 days, people would assume that they converted to Judaism. If Shechem were thought to be Jews, Shimon and Levi knew betach, with confidence, that no nation around them would lift a finger to help. The Netziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin, has this to say. Each of the two brothers has a justification for what Netziv calls setting this fire. He's using a reference to the two sons of Moshe who brought a foreign fire that they were not commanded into the Mishkan, and they died on the spot. The Netziv says each of the brothers, Shimon and Levi, had their own fire they were bringing to this moment. One had the fire of avenging family honor. That's a human emotion. It's understandable, but it's an Eish Zara. It's a foreign fire. Your motive cannot be revenge or personal animosity. That's not acceptable. The other one came without personal considerations, just zealousness for God, outrage against the commission of immorality. This is a holy fire. Nevertheless, even with such a fire, you have to take extreme care to direct its placement and its timing. Otherwise, it can do incalculable damage. See, even with the right intentions, violence can do more damage than help. A latter-day commentator called Hamikra Kifshuto says that Shimon and Levi were knowledgeable, religious people, but by virtue of rationalizations, permissions, heterim, even good people are liable to sink to a level where they can wipe out an entire city without sensing a moral offense of the worst order. Who has the last word in this incident? It's not clear at all. The story seems to end with their father, Yaakov, complaining that now that they've committed this act of gratuitous violence, the sons, is going to diminish him in the eyes of the surrounding tribes. The brothers seem to have the last word at this point when they pose the harsh rhetorical retort, Hachazona yaseh achosenu? Should they be allowed to treat our sister like a harlot? And the narrative changes focus and moves on to something else, Yaakov departing to Beis El. However, maybe the last word here is the result of their actions, the fallout from the incident. 5 verses later, 5 psukim later, we read, Vayihi chitas Elokim al ha'arim asher saviv osehem. The fear of God fell upon all the cities around them. Velo radfu acharei bnei Yaakov, so that they did not pursue the sons of Yaakov. See, this ferocious act got the message across, and afterwards, nobody messed with the Jews. Nobody dared. I mentioned to you that I'm reading a book about Middle East negotiations titled The Only Language They Understand. The funny thing, each side thinks it's written about the other. Okay, it's not so funny, but I'll tell you how it goes. So who really has the last word in this story? Maybe it's their father, Yaakov, Yisrael. Only we have to wait a little while to hear it. Clearly he doesn't forget, and he only spills the tea at the end of his life, 4 parshas later. In Parshas Vayechi, as the book of Genesis is also coming to its close, he calls all the tribes in to bless them. And the blessing for each is in accordance with the actions of each. Shimon and Levi are brought in together for their blessing, and it is a harsh one. Shimon and Levi are comrades. Their weapon is a stolen craft. Shimon v'Levi achim, klei chamas, mecherosehem. Besoidam al tavo nafshi. May my soul not enter into their conspiracy. Arur apam ki oz. Cursed is their rage, for it is intense. It's not a very positive blessing. Ve'evrasam ki kashasha. And their wrath for it is harsh. Achal came be Yaakov. I will separate them within Jacob. Va'afitzem be Yisrael. I will disperse them in Israel. That's the end of their father Jacob's blessing, such as it is to them at the end of his life. What happens? Shimon and Levi do not get a share in the land of Israel. They are dispersed among all the other tribes. Because their weaponry is klei chamas. Got that? If all this feels like it leaves us perplexed and without an answer, let's look to Rabbi Sachs. His answer is also ultimately a question, but it's so clear and resonant, maybe it will help us. Here's his take. He quotes a thought experiment by a scholar, journalist, a politician called Andy Schmuckler, who came up with this thought experiment about 40 years ago. It's called the parable of the tribes. Here's how Rabbi Sachs says it. He says, imagine a group of tribes living close to one another. All choose the way of peace except one that's willing to use violence to achieve its ends. What happens to the peace-seeking tribes? One is defeated and destroyed. A second is conquered and subjugated. And a third flees to some remote and inaccessible place. If the fourth tribe seeks to defend itself, it too will have to have recourse to violence. The irony is that successful defense against a power maximizing aggressor requires a society to become more like the society that threatens it. Power can only be stopped by power. There are, in other words, four possible outcomes: destruction, subjugation, withdrawal, and imitation. In every one of these outcomes, the ways of power are spread throughout the system. This is the parable of the tribes. Recall that all but one of the tribes seeks peace and has no desire to exercise power over its neighbors. Nonetheless, if you introduce a single violent tribe into the region, violence will eventually prevail, however the other tribes choose to respond. That is the tragedy of the human condition. Rabbi Sachs wrote this commentary, which we have in the lobby of the shul if you'd like to take a copy, in 2014, 10 years ago, when Israel was involved in an earlier conflict with Gaza. Now listen to how he concludes and see if it resonates with where we all are now. What the episode of Dinah tells us is not that Jacob or Shimon or Levi were right, but rather there can be situations in which there is no right course of action, where whatever you do is wrong, where every option will involve the abandonment of some moral principle. That is Schmuckler's point, that power is like a contaminant, a disease, which once introduced will gradually but inexorably become universal in the system of competing societies. Shechem's single act of violence against Dinah forced two of Jacob's sons into violent reprisal, and in the end, everyone was either contaminated or dead. It is indicative of the moral depth of the Torah that it does not hide this terrible truth from us by depicting one side as guilty, the other as innocent. Violence defiles us all. It did then, it does now. Thus endeth Rabbi Sachs's powerful and illuminating words, and now we have at very least some more perspective. We're in the darkest part of Kislev now. Soon it'll be Hanukkah. We'll do our best to light up the darkness, and soon the days will gradually begin to lengthen. There will be more sunlight. May we very soon see much more light illuminating our dark times. A good Shabbos.